In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace your front sway bar bushings on this Toyota Camry. They are located on the back of the subframe. I'm going to show you exactly how to get to them. Pretty much every repair manual you're going to look at will say to remove the engine and transmission. However, I'm going to show you a way around that. You do not have to do that. It will require some specialty tools though, such as the engine holder, some chains, pull jacks if you're on a lift, or extra jacks and jack stands if you're on the ground. And you're going to, of course, have to be very careful because we have to basically unbolt the engine from the subframe, lower the subframe, get the bushings out, and then put everything back together. Having said that, let's get started. To support this engine, you have multiple options. On the passenger side right here, on the front of the engine, it's basically pretty simple. There's a lot of bracketry here, very heavy-duty brackets that you can hook a strap or a chain onto and support the engine this way. However, on the transmission side, towards the driver's side, it gets a little tricky because there isn't really much to hold up the engine. There are no brackets, no hooks, none of that. So what I did is I took the starter out and put some chains on the starter bolts. If you have a different idea, go ahead and do that. Maybe you can remove the air box and the battery tray and then strap around the transmission. But whatever you do, make sure it is properly supported. If you choose to do the same thing, let me show you how to remove the starter safely, and then you can go ahead and put those chains on. For this procedure, we have to disconnect the battery. I'm going to take the negative terminal off, take a 10mm wrench or socket and ratchet, and loosen up this mounting nut on the terminal. Once you twist it a few turns, you should be able to pull this up and off. I'm going to clean this corrosion before we reinstall it, but set it aside to where it cannot make connection with the battery terminal. And if you have one of these insulators, I'm going to set it here so I can clean everything up before I put it back together. To get to the starter, we have to remove this air intake piece here, and to do that, you don't necessarily have to remove this cover here that has a bunch of push clips going all around. You can just pry it up here and here. It has two 10mm bolts, and to give yourself a little bit more space, you can pop this push clip out. Now, whether you have this style or just the style that you pry out directly, you do what you have to do, but for me, I have to press the center down on this, and then the push clip comes out. You can do this with a trim tool or a little pocket screwdriver. And now you can take a 10mm wrench, and if you pull this up, you'll see the bolt right in here. You stick your wrench on it and loosen it up. A lot of times these can be somewhat rusty in here, so make sure you don't break it or strip out the head of it. But you should be able to easily remove this. Once this is out, we'll take the, we'll pick up the plastic on this side, and this one's a little trickier to see, but here it is. It's located right about there. Break this one free as well, and remove it the rest of the way. And this is all that's holding this air intake piece on. So once we get this out, we should be able to just pull up on this, just like that, and remove it. There's the starter right there. I'm going to start by disconnecting the signal wire, which is this small one here. I'm pressing on the connector and then going to help it come off with a little pry bar. Sometimes these get stuck in here. Once you take that off, if you peel this boot back, you'll see the main power wire. That is a 12mm mounting nut. So let's grab a socket or a wrench and take that off. Break this free. This shouldn't be very tight, although sometimes it does get stuck. And once you unthread it a little bit, you should be able to just pull it off. Ooh, try not to lose that. Now you can take the main power wire off, set it aside. Two 14mm bolts is all that holds this starter on. So let's put our tool on there, break them free. Before I take this one out all the way, now that it's broken free, I'm actually going to go for the other one, which is a little bit more difficult to reach. You can see it right down there. And I'm going to break it free and remove this one first all the way because, well, it's going to be a little trickier to access. Once you get it broken free most of the way, you should be able to unthread it easily by hand, unless the bolts are severely corroded. Okay, there's one. Now you're gonna have to hold the starter, otherwise it'll put pressure on this bolt and you won't be able to easily loosen it by hand. And remove this front bolt. With that out, We can now remove the starter. Sometimes they get seized in there, right in this area, and you'll have to tap them with a rubber mallet or pry them a little bit. This one is ready to go. So pull it out at an angle like this. Try to find the best way to basically tilt it for it to come out of here. And there is your starter. Here you can see my setup with the starter removed. I put the chains right through those bolts and bottomed them out. And there is a lot of thread inside that engine, and the reason I used both of them is so I can spread the load half and half, or well, mostly half and half, between the two chains and the two bolts so that nothing breaks. Now I want to put some pressure on the engine support here and basically just barely lift the engine up a little so that when I unbolt engine mounts and the subframe and everything, it doesn't drop down. I want it to stay where it's at, because I'm not disconnecting any connectors, any hoses, nothing else. I just want it to stay in place. So I'm going to put even pressure on both of these. I'm just feeling it out, making sure they're even. Of course, I can always adjust later, but for now, this feels good. All 4 of my chains are extra tight, and this has lifted up just a little bit. So let's go underneath and remove some bolts for the engine mounts so we can release pressure. Now from underneath, I want to disconnect the 2 side engine mounts. I'm gonna leave the front alone. I'm gonna leave this attached. If I have to, I can always come back over here and remove it. But my plan is to tilt the subframe back like that in order to access the sway bar bolts. And all we need to do that really is to disconnect the 2 side engine mounts off of the subframe so the engine can stay and the subframe can drop a couple inches. That is all we need. The steering rack is another thing to keep in mind because you don't want to overextend your steering shaft. That's worst case scenario. Best case scenario, you just can't lower the subframe, but I'm going to show you 2 options when it comes time to removing that. For now, let's do the 2 side engine mounts so we can make sure that those are disconnected. On each side, you'll see 2 plastic or rubber caps. You're going to want to pop those off so that we can remove the mounting nuts that are underneath there for the engine mounts. Now the same exact setup applies to both, so do this to the other side as well. Grab your 17mm socket and remove all 3 mounting nuts. And do the same to the other side. I can actually move the engine mount around at this point, so I know that there is minimal pressure on these. Basically, they're just touching, and the engine support beam across the top is doing 90% of the holding of this engine, which is actually ideal. That's exactly what I wanted. Now you have 2 options. You can remove the 2 bolts that hold the power steering rack onto the subframe. You can see one over here and one over there. They both are 17mm in size. However, you can also remove the steering shaft off of the rack right up there with a 12mm headed bolt. And I'm going to choose to do that because the sway bar actually goes over the power steering rack. So if I unbolt it from the subframe and then pull it down, but the sway bar is still attached, it's going to want to pull down the power steering rack with it as the subframe goes down. You can see what I'm talking about right there. If that sway bar comes down, which is what it's going to do, and the power steering rack isn't coming down, it's going to want to make sure it's coming down with it. So basically in the end, we still have to remove the steering shaft. So I'm just going to remove that and separate it. I'll show you exactly how to do that. But it is important to tie off the steering wheel. So let's do that if you choose to do it this way. The easiest way to tie off the steering wheel is going to be with the seat belt, since it's, well, already in the car. And you can just loop it around once or twice, whatever you prefer, and buckle it. And that should be good. Basically, all you're trying to do is prevent it from spinning a bunch of times. If you don't want to do it this way, you can use a bungee cord as well. But if it does spin a lot, it can actually damage the clock spring inside. Your steering wheel will be off, and it just creates more issues than it's worth. So tie it off, make sure it's nice and secure. What you can also do is engage the steering lock. There we go. That is also another safety measure. Now back at the steering shaft, let's take a 12mm socket with an extension and remove that bolt that clamps it down. Take that bolt out. Now take a pry bar and a hammer and hammer the steering shaft up so it can slide off of the steering rack. It should collapse internally up there. If it doesn't, just keep tapping it until it does, because it's most likely just kind of stuck from being like this for a long time. I'm gonna try and hammer this pry bar in there and spread those two halves apart, and then spray some more rust penetrant. There we go, that's removed. So typically you would want to mark the steering shaft as well as the shaft coming out of the steering rack, but if you see that right there, that's from me hitting it with the pry bar, and I basically did that on purpose so that I can line it up. The steering wheel will not move, it's locked, and there's no reason for the steering rack to turn from here on, so that's why I wasn't too worried about it. I'm just gonna line it up with that mark, and that is basically just a chisel mark from my pry bar, so there's no way that can wash off or come off in any way. At the front, your vehicle may have these rubber pieces here that just direct airflow, but if you do have them, you're going to want to remove them. If not, there might still be some hardware here to remove to pull this shield down so we can access the front subframe bolts. These are 10 millimeter in size. And there we go. You don't need to remove the shield, you just need to be able to pull it down like that. In the center, you might have some push clips. And do the same to this side over here. On each rear corner, you'll have two 14 millimeter fasteners that hold on that bracket. Let's remove both of those. There's a bolt and a mounting nut. Do the same to the other side. Now I have the entire subframe supported with this transmission jack with a fuel tank attachment on it, just because it's exactly what fits on here. And I'm going to remove the four 19 millimeter bolts. There's one on each corner, and that is all that holds this subframe onto the vehicle. As soon as we do that, we should be able to slowly lower this with the pull jack and basically get our job done. Now, I will not remove the front bolts unless I absolutely have to. I'm just going to unthread them most of the way, but leave them still threaded in. I will, however, have to remove these two rears. But having said that, let's take all four out. In order to avoid bending this bracket, I'm going to remove these two 14 millimeter fasteners just like I did on the rear so I can get more swing out of it, like I said, without having to bend it. Gonna leave that right about there. Let's do the same to the other side. I'm going to remove this one just so I can inspect this water issue here, but I will put it back. Alright, that's good for now. I'll leave that right there. Now let's lower the subframe. At this point, all we're looking for is some separation here so we can have access to our work area. And of course, we're going to pay attention to the engine, make sure that doesn't come down with the subframe. That is not what we're aiming for. We have supported it, so it should stay, but you want to make sure. All right, that's about it. I'm going to hold pressure on this just in case. The exhaust is our limiting factor here, but this should be plenty of room for us to work. So let's get those sway bar bushings out. All right, this is the best view I can give you, and now all we have to do is just remove those two 12mm headed bolts. I sprayed them down with rust penetrant already, so hopefully that helped. I did that before I started, so that as I undo everything up to this point, those would have time to soak. It looks like, hopefully, it helped. All right, we have one. The other one I'm going to get with a deep socket right up and over here. Okay, one side's off. Now let's do the same to the other side. Here's the other side. Since I have my deep socket on here, might as well start with the one that requires the deep socket, which is the one on the other side of this bushing. Ooh. I have to use a little bit of heat on this one. It's pretty stuck on there and I don't want it to break. So I'm just going to very gently heat up the welded nut that's on the subframe here. As soon as it gets nice and hot, I'm going to pull the torch off and it should come out nice and easy. Yeah, that's what I thought. There it is. I'm going to let that cool down for a little bit. Okay, that's out. Now we can replace those bushings. You should be able to lift the sway bar up. Perfect. While the other side is cooling down still, I'm going to replace the bushing on this side. All you have to do is lift up the sway bar, lift up the bracket, set it aside, and remove the sway bar bushing. There it is. If this here is severely rotted, if it looks like this, clean it up and see if it's still good, because a lot of times the sway bar will rust out here, and if you continue running it like that, it will damage the bushings prematurely and you're going to have to keep putting sway bar bushings on, and clearly this isn't an easy task on this one. So consider replacing your sway bar if it's in poor condition. Not only that, but under a lot of tension, it could snap and break, and you want to try to avoid that. So mine is good, so I'm going to clean it up, grease it up, and we'll put in new bushings. Next, you want to take some silicone paste. I probably have a little bit too much here, but I'm just going to get the excess off when the time comes. And you want to lubricate these with silicone paste. The reason you want to use that is because it will not damage the rubber, and it can lubricate very well for a very long time. I'm going to put plenty in there. Any excess will just squish out, so it's no big deal. And in order to facilitate the installation of the bracket, I'm also going to put a little bit on here as well as on this side right over here, so that that bracket can just slide down nice and easy. And I'll just put whatever I have left on my brush on the sway bar itself. And now you want to make sure that when you install these, the cut is towards the back, so that any water as you drive doesn't get pushed into it. It just kind of sits there. Whereas if you have it face the other way, there is a possibility for wind to push the water into the cut, and then you get water intrusion in there. So open this up and slide it over. Okay, center it up. Now the bracket will have an arrow that points towards the front of the vehicle. Keep that in mind. So make sure you put it on the right way. And before you go any further, let's replace the other side. Same thing on the other side. Pull this off, remove the bushing. Inspect the sway bar. Silicone paste on here, silicone paste on the bushing. Clamp this over. And the bracket. This is now ready to be bolted back up. Stick one bolt through. I put anti-seize on the threads to hopefully prevent it from seizing in the future. Next time these have to be replaced, this should come off a lot easier. And get this one started. Just going to drive these down all the way now. Okay, gonna make sure this one's snug also. The torque on these is only 20 foot-pounds. There's no way I can get a torque wrench in here, so I'm just going to make sure they are nice and tight by hand. All right. I also have anti-seize on the threads, so that'll facilitate the tightening of these bolts. Now, let's tighten up the other side. All right, let's get the bolts in on this side. Make sure everything is lined up. All right, same torque applies, 20, but I can't torque them, so I'm just going to make them tight. All right. Perfect. All right, everything's ready to go back up, so let's lift up the subframe. Oh, make sure that it still lines up at the back here. There we go. That's better. Put some pressure on it, and let's put the main bolts through so that it gets clamped down. I'm obviously going to come back and fully tighten them in a little bit. For now, I just want to seat them all. I'm going to tighten the front ones as well. The torque on these main subframe bolts is, well, extremely tight. I'm just going to put my impact on them and then run them in until they are very tight. Basically, you don't want these to move, you don't want these to back out. I did put some anti-seize on this large washer here to remove some of the friction that could happen here, and basically just run them in. And if you don't have an impact, just use your breaker bar and make them very tight. That's the best I can do, because if these are loose at all, the entire front end is resting on it. You hit one bump and it starts, the whole subframe will start moving and popping, and you want to avoid that. While we're here, let's put the bolts for this bracket on. Those don't obviously have to be as tight, but make sure they're also tight. And repeat that with the other 3 subframe bolts and brackets. This bolt hole didn't line up anymore, so I had to make sure that I can get this bolted on. Now we should be able to remove our support. Now, since we're here, let's put the engine mount bolts or mounting nuts back on. The torque for these is 73 foot-pounds. And put these caps back in. Let's do the same to the other side. Also 73 foot-pounds for this one as well. It's got the same fasteners. It's basically the same mount, just on the other side. And let's get those 2 covers back on. Let's get this piece back now. When you tighten these bolts or the screws, just make them snug. They're only going into plastic and you don't want to strip out the plastic insert. And do the same to the other side. Don't forget about your 2 push clips. Now it's time to connect the steering shaft back up, and I scrubbed off some of the rust, and now I'm going to put some anti-seize on it. If you don't have anti-seize, you can use some grease. Basically, I like to lubricate it and make sure I put some sort of anti-corrosive coating on it so that it can come off a lot easier in the future. Now you'll remember I have that line there, that mark from where I chiseled it. I'm going to keep that uncovered so that I can see exactly where I'm lining it up. If you marked it differently, well, do whatever you have to do, but I'm going to make sure that that mark stays uncovered. I can always cover it back up later. Now I'm going to take that steering shaft that's coming out of the vehicle side, extend it, slide it down. Hopefully it's still in the same position for you. It is for me. Yeah, looks like it's perfectly lined up still. So I'm just going to wiggle it, press it down, double check it to make sure it's still lined up. Yep, that looks perfectly lined up for me. So I'm going to continue pressing this down. Just wiggle it back and forth. It should seat eventually. If you're having trouble, you can use a small hammer and kind of tap it into place. Looks like I seated it pretty much. Now that it's seated, let's get the bolt through. I lubricated the bolt with some anti-seize as well. The torque for this is 26 foot-pounds. Make sure you torque it. If you are unable to torque this, just make it nice and tight. You obviously don't want this to come off. Everything's back together down underneath, so I can safely remove the engine support that I have here and basically put pressure back on the engine mounts. We'll put the starter back and everything. So first thing is to release pressure as evenly as possible. And now, however you hooked things up here, get your chains out, your engine support and everything else, and then I'll show you how to put the starter back in. If you have a lot of corrosion down there, clean it up with a piece of sandpaper, a wire brush, or whatever you have. I'm just going to wipe mine off. This area is in fairly good condition here, so I'm not too worried about it. But just so you know, the starter does ground through here. Basically, it's touching the engine block, and that's the ground for it. So if you aren't making a good connection here, you're going to have some starting issues. There we go. Slides in nice and smooth, bottoms out all the way. Make sure your wires aren't pinched or caught anywhere. I'm going to wait to put those on, and for now I'm just going to put on this front bolt because it's the easiest one to start, and this will ensure that everything is lined up. I'm going to thread it in as much as I can do it by hand. I guess all the way it is. And let's put in the other one that goes on the back there. Might be a little trickier to get to. If you want to, you can pull this hose off of this bracket a little bit, and it should give you just a smidge more room. This one, once you get your hand in here, you'll have to kind of do it by feel, but once you start it in, you should be able to use that extension with your socket, if this is what you use to remove it, and just thread it on. Okay, that's bottomed out. So I'm going to grab the torque wrench, torque these down. The torque for both of these is 27 foot-pounds. I won't be able to stick my torque wrench back there just because of the space limitations. So I'm going to put my ratchet in with the extension, and 27 foot-pounds is really not super tight. So I'm just going to basically snug it up. There we go. just about 1/8 of a turn after it bottoms out and gets snug. That should be plenty tight. I can, however, torque this one, so I will. Once again, 27 foot-pounds is the torque. All right, that's 27. Grab the power wire and peel this boot back and inspect it. You want to make sure that it doesn't have corrosion on it. Mine is okay, but it does have a little bit, so I'm going to try to clean this up the best I can with a wire brush. It's not severe. I just want to make sure it's going to have a good contact so I can get proper amperage delivered to the starter. That looks good right there. So now I'm going to slide this over. Make sure that these two tabs line up with the flat spots on the starter. And now with this on, let's put on the mounting nut. As you snug this up, make sure this still lines up here. And when you tighten it, you just want to snug it a little bit. These are brass studs and they can break internally. So right here is bottomed out, just a little bit extra, and that is plenty tight. At this point, if you wanted to, you could put some dielectric grease over it or some battery terminal protector on here so you can protect the terminal, but it does have this boot which is supposed to do that job, and it seems like it's been working for this one, so I'm just going to put the boot back. And don't forget about the signal or trigger wire, whatever you want to call it. Click that in. Now let's put this piece back. Make sure it slides onto the air filter housing properly, and then you're going to have to tuck it underneath the radiator top cover here and line it up with the 2 bolt holes. Once these line up, slide the bolts down. I suggest putting some anti-seize or grease on these threads because they do often seize up. They're pretty much out in the open here. And tighten them down. Just snug, that's all you need to do. Let's put the other one in. Ow. Nice and snug. Grab your tool, and then if you remove this push clip, go ahead and put it back. Now take your negative battery terminal and connect it to the battery. Sometimes it can make a little spark. I cleaned up all the corrosion. I also got rid of that pad that's down there, and sometimes it's useful. Other times, if it was full of corrosion like mine was, it's actually worse off being there, so you're better off taking it off. Anyway, put this battery terminal back on in, make it nice and snug. Don't crush it down because it'll actually stretch this right here, and then you will have a hard time tightening it up in the future. As long as you can't spin it by hand like this, you're good to go. So this is tight enough. Keep in mind, on some of these vehicles, when you disconnect the battery, you may have to recalibrate the steering angle sensor, and that entails turning the steering wheel all the way to the left and then all the way to the right, and then centering it up so that the sensor can relearn its positions on both ends and in the center. Unbuckle your seatbelt, take it off the steering wheel, and take it for a road test to make sure everything is good.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.